Welcome to part 2 in my discussion about Love Hina, and yet again there is a spoiler warning in effect just in case. Okay, so in my last video I had this knee-jerk reaction to Love Hina. I did not like it and I pretty much had to vent. But I've calmed down a bit now and I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about why I felt the show was so disappointing. And just so you know where I'm coming from, this show is the only part of Love Hina that I'm really familiar with. I have not read the manga. I have seen just the very beginning of the follow-up OVA Love Hina Again, but aside from the story advancement in the opening scene, my opinion is exactly the same. So here I'm only talking about the TV series. I actually feel like the show failed in two main respects, the story and the characters. First, let's talk about the story. Now, I realize not every anime has to have a completely elaborate story, so I'm not going to be as harsh in this regard. But if you look at any similar show out there like Tenchi Muyo or even a newer show like School Rumble, what makes those shows arguably better is that the central protagonist in each show goes on a journey, whether it's an actual journey or just an internal change. They are constantly facing new challenges and they're growing as characters, and their relationships with the other characters evolve over the course of each series. And of course, lots of funny and crazy stuff happens along the way. With Love Hina, though, you have the main character of Keitaro, who starts out as a doormat. By the end of the show, he's still a doormat, probably even more so if that's even possible. He never really accomplishes any of his goals, nothing really gets resolved, he never becomes stronger or more confident, he never makes any kind of positive change. And that's why it feels so tacked on to have this romantic subplot where at the end of the show he ends up getting the girl. It's not believable because there's no build-up to it. Outside of one event that I talked about in my last video, nothing happens to establish a good relationship between these two. And that's kind of important because the rest of the time, the relationship between Keitaro and most of the other characters is, well, pretty much this. And that brings us to the other problem. Now, assuming that we can forgive the simplistic nature of the story, the show has to be supported by really appealing characters. In a way, this is actually more important because shows like this tend to be much more character-driven. Going back to Tenchi Muyo, part of why everyone remembers these characters is because they're very likable and inviting. You feel welcome when you're around these characters. And of course they do fight about different things, but at the end of the day there's a very tangible sense of a kind of family mentality where everyone really comes together. By comparison, the character dynamic in Love Hina is just relentlessly mean-spirited and confrontational. I can forgive that at the beginning of the show since Keitaro's the one guy at an all-girl apartment and bathhouse. Of course there's going to be some conflict at first, and that's part of what makes it interesting. You want to see how they're going to deal with this problem or overcome it. But here's the thing. That conflict only works for a little while at the beginning. At some point, though, you have to let the characters move on. And whether they overcome the problem or not, their motivation for feeling the way that they do should be clear. They have to act in a way that is at least in some way reasonable. Instead, Love Hina takes that initial conflict and then looks for any paper-thin excuse to wallow in it for 24 episodes. But then in the final episode, all the girls suddenly realize that they have warm, fuzzy feelings for the guy just in time for the series to have a happy ending. And you can't do it like that. I never throughout the entire series felt like these were nice people to be around. And you're suddenly telling me at the end of the series that now everyone likes each other and that makes it okay? No, it doesn't. And part of the problem is that these characters aren't really consistent. On one hand, we're supposed to believe that these are all very smart girls. They're all students, they're very high achievers, and several of them actually have a genius-level intellect. But then, whenever there's some situation with Keitaro, they all immediately jump to the most ridiculous conclusions when common sense dictates that they should know better. There's one episode, for example, where someone breaks into the apartment and kidnaps Keitaro, and all the girls in a very rare moment go, "Hey, that's not cool, we need to go find him and save him!" And meanwhile, the kidnapper has him tied up. So when they find him, their honest-to-God reaction is, "Oh no! Keitaro's a pervert! He likes weird things like being tied up! You should be ashamed of yourself!" And they're not just messing with him to be funny. They're actually offended and blaming him for being tied up. Why would you think that? You knew that he was kidnapped. That's the whole reason you showed up here, to rescue him. And it's common in cartoon logic for kidnappers to tie up their victims. What part of him being tied up makes you think that it's part of a sexual fetish, and why would you think that any part of this is his fault? Oh, but you're going to just throw out these characters' entire motivation for being in the scene and eliminate all the potential character development in the episode just for the sake of a lame sex joke to embarrass the victim. That doesn't make sense, and it's not funny. You can't just have the characters instantly turn brick stupid for no reason. And the show is filled with moments like that, where they're basically just looking for excuses to embarrass or beat the shit out of the guy, even if he hasn't done anything, even if there's no reason to believe that he's done anything. And I actually have talked to a female friend of mine about this show. She hasn't seen it, but based on the description, she said, well, it might be funny to watch a show where a guy gets beat up a lot. And in the interest of being fair, I would agree. If the character in question was actually a jerk. It would be a lot more amusing to see bad things happen to him if we knew that on some level he actually deserved it. But Keitaro, despite being a bit shy and clumsy, is in fact a genuinely good person. I'm not exactly rooting for him, but he really doesn't do anything to deserve the level of abuse that he takes. I mean, seriously, I think of all the times he gets beaten up, about 10 to 15% of it is because of a relatively small social blunder, and 85 to 90% of the time it's because one of the other characters misread a situation, started blaming him for shit he didn't do, or just started wailing on him for no goddamn reason. In fact, there's a part in the second to last episode where Keitaro finally leaves the apartment and goes to live with this other girl who's actually nice to him, and I actually thought, good! Get as far away from that place as possible! But then several of the other characters show up and literally beat him into submission so that he'll go back to the apartment and realize that he really, really likes this other girl who's been beating him up the whole time. And he does. And this is also part of why Keitaro is not a compelling character, because he doesn't stand for anything. The one time he actually stands up for himself and makes a decision to go after something that will make him happy, he just rolls right back over as soon as everyone else tells him to. And the really horrifying thing is, we are actually supposed to root for this. We're actually meant to want him to go back to the apartment and end up with this girl who's been mean to him throughout the entire series, and there's no reason for it except that one character has more screen time than the others. After all this, I don't know what this show's message is supposed to be, I don't know who it's trying to appeal to, but it's offensive on many levels, and it's quite literally abusive. And it's a real shame too. The animation is good and the character design is actually very nice. It just seems like a lot of wasted effort because the main elements driving the show are handled so poorly. But you know what? I'm still not done. Coming up, I still have a few closing thoughts, including some elements that I thought were positive, and some other ideas on what I personally think would have helped salvage the show. I'll see you in part 3.